One of the things that frustrates me about what we see and hear in the news nowadays, it's sure, of course, it's important to report on corruption in Washington, corruption in the White House, corruption in the Trump campaign, all of those things. But it seems that that's all we ever talk about. And while we fixate on certain issues, we neglect others that are of the utmost seriousness, literally life and death questions where I am sorry to say it's my belief that the United States is on the side at times of very evil doings. And here to talk to us now about one situation I wish got a lot more press coverage. First of all, I should explain the situation is Yemen and our what I consider our complicity in the violence there and the humanitarian disaster there. Here to discuss the situation in Yemen with us now is Stephen Miles. Stephen is a friend of the program. He has, of course, been on before. He is the executive director of Win Without War, an organization dedicated to promoting a more just and humane national security policy. So first of all, Stephen, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks, RJ. Good to be here, although a sad topic to talk about today.
Yes, it certainly is. Well, let's start with a little bit of background. First of all, on Win Without War, for people who haven't seen your previous appearances on this show, just a brief description, if you would, of what you guys do.
Sure. Win Without War is an organization and a network of organizations that exist to promote, as you said, a more just and peaceful foreign policy for America. We were founded in the run-up in the opposition to the Iraq War, and we continue today to work to advocate for a more sensible, more realistic, more peaceful American foreign policy.
And then in terms of Yemen and our role there, I've talked about it a lot on this program, but your take on what's going on there.
Yeah, so we have to start with the reality that the situation in Yemen, the ongoing war in Yemen, has led to the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet right now. Several million Yemenis are in imminent danger of famine. We have seen well over 10,000 lives lost. I say well over because we don't know, frankly. The official count of innocent civilians killed in the war is 10,000. Estimates are it's at least 50,000 and frankly, likely much higher. And that's just killed in the war. That's not counting those who died of starvation, disease. Yemen has seen the largest outbreak of cholera in the modern era. And all of this is a consequence of the Saudi-led intervention that began in 2015. It was an effort to address what had happened on the ground in Yemen, which was that a movement called the Houthi movement had taken over the country. The government of President al-Hadi, the president of Yemen, had fled the capital, had been pushed out of the country. The Saudis led this intervention primarily with folks from the United Arab Emirates, but also with folks on the ground, fighters such as the Janjaweed militia from Sudan, mercenaries from Latin America and others, ostensibly to push the Houthis back to retake the country for the government of Yemen. The war has been an epic disaster. It is largely stalemated. There has been tremendous fighting. And what we've seen is that the Saudis and their Emirati allies have engaged in a deliberate and purposeful effort to do things like blow up water treatment facilities, to shut off access to food that is causing the disease, causing the famine, causing the suffering that we're seeing in Yemen. And you're absolutely right to say that the United States is not just complicit in this, we are involved in this in every conceivable manner. We are refueling the Saudi and Emirati jets in the air. We are selling them those jets. We are selling them those bombs. We have trained them. We are continuing to provide intelligence support. If we are not involved in this war, it belies the concept of being involved. So while there are not American traditional forces on the ground, there are questions about what American special forces may or may not be present. But in reality, this war would not be happening today. Yet the Saudi and Yemeni involvement would not be nearly at the level it is right now without American support. And therefore, we have to understand that this is a war that America is very much involved in.
And just to put some more detail, even more detail on the horror going on there, Stephen Miles. The United Nations issued a special report on Yemen, and among other things, it says that every 10 minutes on average, a child under 5 dies of preventable causes there as a result of this this horrific attack that we are aiding and abetting, which means that in the time that it takes to listen to this interview you and I are conducting, it's almost certain that a child, perhaps more than one, will die of preventable causes relating to that attack. 18 million people in Yemen are food insecure. 8.4 million Yemenis don't know where their next meal is coming from. 3 million acutely malnourished Yemenis are either children under 5, pregnant women, or nursing mothers. Nearly half of all children between the ages of 6 months and 5 years are chronically malnourished and stunted, conditions that will affect them for the rest of their lives. Children are being forced to fight and work at very young ages. Young women are being forced into marriage. Millions of Yemenis have no access to safe drinking water. 1 million people are suffering from watery or suffered from watery diarrhea and cholera. Last year, there is high risk of another cholera epidemic. And as you say, more than 10,000 civilians, we don't know how many more, have been killed in the fighting. So the scope of the horror is almost impossible for the human brain to register. With all that in mind, why do you think it is that it's getting so little play on the news? Last time someone checked was Adam Johnson of the media group FAIR, for example, even MSNBC, the liberal, which is known as the liberal news network, had not reported on Yemen in over a year. Why do you think it's getting so little discussion? Why aren't more politicians talking about it, more news people and so on? What do you attribute that to?
I think there's a number of factors at play, and I think we should be cognizant that we're having this conversation today, hopefully in a moment where, for terrible reasons, that situation has changed. CNN and others are covering the horrific attack earlier today in Yemen, in which dozens of children, upwards of 50 individuals and over 70 were killed in a Saudi attack on a bus containing many, many children going to school. Estimates are at least 29 children, but possibly more, were killed. 77 individuals also wounded. So we're seeing some breakthrough of that news today, partially because media outlets close to the Houthis, where the attack, who were in the region where the attack took place, were putting out video and putting out statements. But that gets to the kind of bigger issue that you're talking about. Why aren't we seeing this on the news? Why aren't we hearing about this more often? And frankly, one of the realities there is that unlike the situation in Syria, which happened on the doorstep of Europe and which led to a refugee crisis of many, many millions of folks out of Syria and into Europe and the surrounding areas, this is not happening in an accessible part of the world. Yemen is one of the most impoverished countries in the world. The refugees, and there are millions of them in Yemen, are largely internally displaced and unable to flee to other locations. There's also a media blackout. The Saudis and the Emiratis, who largely control access in and out of the country, are not allowing journalists in. Unlike in Syria, where journalists could report from Beirut, where journalists, many news agencies had bureaus. They had well-established relationships with so-called stringers, folks on the ground who can help facilitate stories. That type of infrastructure simply doesn't exist in Yemen. So it's been hard to get facts out. It's been hard to get journalists on the ground. It's been hard to get video out. And the people themselves are trapped in this horrible situation. They're trapped within the confines of this war, not only through the realities of the war, but also through our own policies. Yemen, of course, is on Donald Trump's Muslim ban. Folks from Yemen are not allowed to come to America. We're unable to hear their voices firsthand, largely. And so we basically have an imposed media blackout on this horrible situation. And it's frankly something that needs to change. We need more outlets like yours that are willing to have these conversations, that are willing to put this front and center, and are willing to talk about the role that we as Americans have in this war, because our country is involved.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And again, we're talking with Stephen Miles, Executive Director of Win without war. And I should note for our viewers and listeners that we are recording on Thursday, which is we do pre-record the program, which is the date that this horrific attack was reported, and the latest death toll. I have seen, Stephen, from the head of a health department in Saada, the city of the attack, the site of the attack. Abdul Ghani Sarid, told Reuters that the death toll was now up to 43, with 61 wounded. And of course, that could go up at any time. So you, Stephen, you very accurately and amply described the depth of our own involvement in this process. How long have we been involved aiding the Saudis in conducting this humanitarian catastrophe? How long has our U.S. involvement been there?
We've been involved since day one, and we've actually been involved before that if you consider and factor in that the United States has been arming and training the Saudi military and the Emirati military who are leading this intervention for years. In fact, Yemen is one of those examples where the reality of America's flooding of the Middle East with weapons, our training of endless forces, is really most farcically on display. For a long time, part of what's been happening in Yemen originally was that the forces loyal to former Yemeni President Saleh were allied with the Houthis. Now, President Saleh famously was deposed as part of the Arab Spring. And so what you then had were these forces that the U.S. had trained, that we had armed, that we had given tremendous support as part of our counterterrorism operation, fighting on one side of a conflict against forces allied with President Hadi, trained, armed, equipped by the Americans to fight counterterrorism missions, fighting on the other side of the conflict. You then introduce these Emirati and Saudi forces, trained, armed, equipped by the United States, fighting on one side. And then add into the mix just reports that we've seen this week that ostensibly the branch of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, often called AQAP. This is ostensibly public enemy number one for America, often called the most dangerous element of Al-Qaeda in America, famously involved in things such as the attempted underwear bombing in America. I might have the exact bombing there wrong, but a number of attempted bombings in America. The folks involved in this branch, we find out from the AP that the UAE and Saudi Arabia, having told us that they're also involved in fighting them, that they're combating them, it turns out that they've actually been cutting deals with them, that some of those forces have been recruited into their fighting forces on the ground, that they've been paying them off. So the absurdity of what America's foreign policy is not just that we're involved, it's that we're involved in every side of this, that our weapons are on every side of this, and that on one day we might be bombing one side of this war, and on the other day we might be helping that same side.
Yeah, it's absolute insanity. And for people who don't know, by the way, although the head of the Central Command, General Votel, told senators we're not parties to this conflict, it's now come out in the New York Times that roughly a dozen U.S. Army commandos have been on site at the Saudi-Yemeni border. They're helping to guide airstrikes and that sort of thing. So we are not only involved morally, ethically, financially, economically, and militarily, but actually have, in effect, at least a handful of troops on the ground. So what can people do, Stephen? How can people, first of all, stay informed, and secondly, make their voices heard in opposition to the horrific things we're aiding and abetting in Yemen?
Well, I think it's important that we have conversations like this, and so folks like you and others who have outlets need to continue to talk about what's going on in Yemen and hold these kinds of conversations to discuss not only what's happening, but our role. So first, again, let me say thank you for your responsible programming decision here. Second, I'd be remiss if I didn't say you can always find out more at our website, www.winwithoutwar.org. You can find ways to take action there. You can get more information about the conflict. But there really are a lot of opportunities. There's some amazing organizations like Oxfam and Amnesty International that are involved, that are taking action here. There's other activist organizations like Just Foreign Policy, MoveOn.org, others that have been involved in these efforts. And we have opportunities to make our voice heard, and we will continue to have opportunities to make our voices heard. In the last several months and the last years, Congress has in fact held votes on this war. They have in fact weighed in, and they're going to likely have the opportunity to do that again in the future. Amidst all of this death, amidst all of this destruction, the Trump administration is trying to sell billions and billions of more weapons to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The reality is that those weapon sales have to go through Congress. And so we're going to have an opportunity where members of Congress are going to have to decide, are they going to continue to pour gasoline on this fire, or are they going to take the simple act of saying, if you are engaged in war crimes, if you are blowing children up in a school bus, if you are killing people at their weddings, we are not as a country going to continue arming you. That's the choice before members of Congress. They're going to have to address that likely later this fall, and it's up to us to make sure that they hear from the American public.
Well, thank you. Very well said. And we will definitely stay on this story. And I know you guys will continue doing your good work against it as well. Stephen Miles, Executive Director of Win Without War. Thanks so much for your good work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having the conversation.